So I'd like to welcome everyone to another episode with Mondays with Moshe. This is Moshe Norman, and I'm here tonight with Naomi Feil, who is older than all of us, but I'm not going to say how old because I don't want to burst her bubble. And Naomi, if you care to say, you can say that. But she is having a big birthday coming up very soon.
I'll be 90 years old.
Wow, Kanai Nahara.
Very soon, in July 22nd.
Kanai Nahara, God bless you.
Thank
Naomi
you.
was actually talking just before you logged on, and she was discussing life in Munich, Germany, where she was born. And the Nazis kind of kicked them out of Germany. Very similar story to my own great-grandparents and grandfather, who was evicted, so to say, from Germany by some good connections in the SS, who sort of drove them out, or I guess I would say advised, very strongly advised. In Naomi's case, in 1937, she was a young girl. She and her sister and her parents left Munich, Germany. Tell us a little bit about who your father was, what he did in Germany, and then subsequently what happened when he came to New York.
Okay, he was a psychologist, and he has a PhD, and there was a home for orphan boys in Munich called Lehrlingsheim, and he was the director of this home. And my mother was then called the matron of the home. And later, of course, she got her master's degree in social work, so she became the social worker for the home when they emigrated to United States. But yeah, my father, he was a kind of revolutionary in his field because, and this is later on, when we lived in the home for old people, for the aged in Cleveland, and he started, I think he was the first one to start sheltered workshops. This was during the war. And so he got a lot of rubber from tires that was attached to tires, and you got like $10 for 100 pounds of rubber, maybe only $5. So all the residents of this home loved to work because they were earning money. They didn't have to depend on aid for the aged at that time. But my father had a lot of criticism from social workers that saying, look, these people have worked all their lives. They should be sitting and enjoying life. That you shouldn't have them work again. But my father was really convinced that this idea of rehabilitation, that people need a sense of identity. And so if you were a tailor when you were young, you brought your equipment in, and he opened up a tailor shop. And there was a shoemaker shop. And the people that were farmers were able to farm because he had a plot of land. So he really wanted the people to continue with their own sense of who they were, not just old people sitting, dying in a wheelchair.
Wow. What was your father's drive to give what was your father's motivation to have people maintain a sense of their own old identity?
Well, maybe it was his experience in Germany, where he really had to fight for his identity. And I think he was a psychologist. He studied psychology. And I think he believed very firmly that people need to have an identity.
Well, he must have also cared very deeply about people in order to maintain a style like that accommodates everybody.
You mean my father?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about your revolutionary validation. Validation existed beyond 89 years ago.
Yeah.
But you took validation to a new level, and you brought tremendous awareness to the power of validation and how it can really break through to people.
Well,
I want to hear from you, but I do want to say that in a few minutes, I would like to play actually play the video that really tugged at my heartstrings, which I'm sure many of you have seen. It's the video of Naomi Feil and Gladys Wilson. You know, that really, really touched my heart. And then I'm going to tell you how I used it with my own grandmother. When she was, I used that with my own grandmother when she was in her mid-90s and in the nursing home. And I'm going to tell you some things about how your work influenced that.
Right. Oh, I'm
Okay.
so happy to hear that. That's great.
So tell me about your relationship with validation, when it started to talk to you, and what did you figure out about validation that people before you didn't know?
Well, I started at Montefiore Home, which is a home for the aged. There are about 90 residents there. And this was in 1963. And my training was a social group worker. So, and I was told to work at the special service department where all the people had a diagnosis of dementia, some very severe. So I formed a group of these people because that was my background. And one day I was, what I did was my job was to have the people communicate with each other because they were isolated. And after they isolated, they stopped talking. They became living dead people. And this is something, having grown up in the home as a little kid, I loved the old people because we had just come to America from Germany and I didn't have many friends in school. So my friends were the old people and we lived right in the home. And I had a friend, Florence Lou, she lived right opposite me. And we would have a signal that when the nurses went away at night, we would knock 3 times. That meant the nurses were gone. So she would come out and we would go to the local pharmacy and have a chocolate phosphate. And we did that every night until one day we were having so much fun. And I heard this nurse voice saying, "There she is." And she had 2 policemen with her. And the sad story about this was that this lady, Florence Lou, who was my good friend, the resident of the home, they took her away. And when she came back, she couldn't talk. She could hardly walk. She was like a living dead person. So I guess they had restrained her, and I think medication was just beginning to come out. Thorazine, Stelazine, all the tranquilizing drugs. And Mrs. Lou was a different person, and she wasn't my friend anymore.
Wow.
She's gone.
Wow. And so how did that lead you to validation? That's such a sad story.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I knew the people, they were my friends. And so when I got my degree in social work and group work, I went back to the same home where I grew up and I started a group. My father had started an area, today they call them Alzheimer's wings. He called it special services. And there the people were who were diagnosed with it from a mild to a very severe dementia. And that's where I went to work. And as a group worker, I got my group together. And well, for example, one man, his name was Isidore Rose, they restrained him and put him in the special service because he would take his cane. He had a cane. He had been a lawyer, and not a successful lawyer. And he took his cane and he would say, "God damn son of a bitch, doctor." She said that my father was castrating him in the attic. And so that's why he was in my group. Everyone was afraid of him. And I tried everything. I tried reality orientation, which was very popular. You know, the day, the date, where you are. I took him to the attic and I said, "Mr. Rose, look around. There's no blood. There's just suitcases in this attic." But he kept his eyes closed. He wouldn't even look at me and he walked away. I had to lead him back downstairs. And I asked my father to come to my group. And I said, "Look at this nice man, Mr. Rose. He wouldn't hurt you. And Mr. Rose turned around. He wouldn't look at my father. And when my father left, God damn son of a bitch, I found out, well, what happened, two things. One day when he was so mad, I was still, I was in my 20s at this time, but I was still rebelling, I think, against the authority. My father was German, very authoritative. And so when Mr. Rose said, God damn it, doctor, one day I said, right on. I was really angry at my father. And Mr. Rose stopped and he looked at me. And we were like one person at that moment.
Wow.
And so
is that when something clicked for you?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
That's when it dawned on you that rolling with the emotion will get you further than trying to talk to the
right.
to the logic.
Right. And
wow.
Yeah.
So that was a great turning point. So you owe Mr. Rosen a lot.
Yeah.
You owe him your career, Mr. Rosen.
My career, Isidore Rose. That's right.
Mr. Rose. Right. Yeah. Okay. But
Isidore Rose. He said to someone, he said, "There's my mother and my aunt," and someone else said, "You're 90 years old. Your mother and aunt are no longer alive." And he said, "Oh, yes, they are. They're alive on a technicality." He was a lawyer.
I just want to say hello and give a shout out to Naomi's daughter, Vicky, who's on here with us and made this happen. Thank you, Vicky, for facilitating this for us. We really, really appreciate it. Naomi Feil is talking about validation and her famous book, The Validation Breakthrough. We're getting a little bit of a history as to how you just became aware of the power of validation. And we know that people who preceded you, Kohut and Rogers, and spoke about empathy and validation. But what we're trying to figure out is, what did you discover about validation that they may have not known that you brought to us? And what I'm hearing so far is that you learned that people will settle and connect, and even those with dementia or Alzheimer's would be able to calm down and change their behavior and sort of get past something or get over something when you provided them with that validation. Whether it was accurate or inaccurate hardly played any role.
Yeah, well, I had a group, and Vicky, you had something.
Go ahead, Vicky.
I feel it's extremely important to say two things at this point. Sorry for interrupting.
That's all right.
And the validation method, as developed by my mom, has three parts to it. One is the basic attitude, and that's where you're focusing a lot of attention. And of course, that is extremely important. But the other two legs of that tripod, one is the theory, which you referenced, of course, Rogers and Erickson and Freud and Jung and the greats that my mother studied, and also later on incorporated people like Bandler and Grinder and some new ideas. She's an extraordinary person who tried many, many things, but the theory came later. It was born out of her practice, all the stories.
Yes.
And then came the theory and the goals and the principles. Those anchor one side of the triangle. The basic attitude is up here at the top, which is emotive empathy, honesty, integrity, etc. And on the other side are these techniques. And the techniques are simple. You guys know 90% of them because you're professionals. And she pulled in a little NLP, she pulled in a little karate, all the things that she experienced in her very rich life came into the techniques. And it was trial and error. I'm sorry for butting in, but I just needed to make the triangle really clear. You talk about, she developed the validation method. Nobody before her was doing it, and nobody has come up with anything better since.
Mm-hmm.
Because the validation method works with people who are verbal and also people who express themselves non-verbally. Validation can be done individually, and it can be done in group settings like you developed it. So that's all.
No, that's important.
Say all that.
That's important. And you know, I have some questions here that are going to follow up on some of the things you said, but I think we're almost at 20 minutes in, and I'd like to, if it's okay with you, I'd like to share the video of Naomi, Feil, and Gladys, which has been, you know, just a breakthrough in my connection with validation. And then we can continue this discussion after. Is that okay, Vicki, Naomi?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. Let's do it. Let me get the sound on. Let me get Gladys.
Good afternoon. When people are very old and deteriorated and no one enters their world and they're just sitting there, they will withdraw inward more and more. And their desperate need for connection is all now inside. And if a person is all alone, even if they're very, very deteriorated, there's a longing for this kind of closeness. Mrs. Wilson? Hello. You want me to sit? Can you see me good? Gladys Wilson is a wonderful example of a person who is in the phase of repetitive motion, where people use movements, repetitive movements, because they don't have any more speech or very little speech, but they have human needs that need to be expressed. You're crying. You're crying. You have a tear right here in your face. You have a little pain. You don't want me to touch you. You're very sad. Can you see me? Is it scary? Are you afraid? And if this person sits with their eyes closed, rocking back and forth, and maybe there's a tear coming down, there's a need there. There's a little tear that's coming out. Do you feel it? You feel a little tear? If you gently use touch, and I touched Gladys Wilson for the fingertips right here on the cheek, is where the mother usually touches a child. If you touch an infant there, it looks up, and every cell remembers where it was touched by the mother. And often that person knows, even if they can't say a word at that moment, they won't talk, or they don't want to talk, but there's a communication. And that person is no longer alone. Can you let me in a little bit? You think? Just a little? You think I could be with you and Jesus for a minute? Jesus loves me, yes, I know, for the Bible tells me so. I used music, because when speech is gone, music, especially with Gladys Wilson, it was religious music, because there's emotion tied to it and safety tied to it. So I used her old church songs. Jesus loves me, yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me, the Bible tells me so. What I did was, when she moved, I moved with her. And when I was singing, because she didn't sing with me, so I matched the intensity of my voice to the intensity of her movement. And pretty soon, for a split second, we became one person. Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. So at one point, when she got very quiet and very peaceful, and my voice became very quiet as hers and very peaceful, and my breathing slowed to her breathing, she pulled me to her, and I moved with her. And for her, at that moment, I believe I was a symbol of her mom. Can you open your eyes now? Do you see me? Feel safe and warm? Yes? Can you sing with me? He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got the mothers and the fathers. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hand. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hand. The breakthrough doesn't happen every time. The person will not always open their eyes and look at you. But if you keep trying and you keep centering yourself and really look at that person and really mirror their movements, maybe not this time, but the next time you come, you'll have a communication. You feel safe. You feel safe? Yeah. With Jesus? Yeah. And me?
Wow. Now, you know, what's fascinating is that when I Googled the video to show it tonight, one of the things that struck me is that some of the comments on Google were about how a nice Jewish woman is singing about Jesus with her black patient, and people found that to be, you know, speaking of when you say I was one with the person, you know, people found that to be very, very interesting.
I think that's an important task for a loving caregiver, is to find the bond, the emotional bond between yourself and the person who is diagnosed with a dementia.
Mm-hmm. And so you went back to the old church songs that
Right.
she was familiar with.
Right.
But you know, to me, what's so fascinating is we think of people with dementia and Alzheimer's as having dead brain cells. And there must be something more, because you can't reignite dead brain cells. So how do we understand the mind or the brain of someone who is nonverbal or is not verbal anymore? And then I'm going to want to also go to, how do you understand children or repressed memories or children? How would we apply this? But let's first start with those with dementia or Alzheimer's. How much of their memory is dead brain cells, versus repressed or for some reason shut down?
Well, I think the disease label is very unfortunate. And I think that's what happened with the Alzheimer's, unfortunately, Association call these people diseased. They have a disease. But in what I've learned through practice and also in the theory, as Vicki said in the beginning, that brain cells do die. The body deteriorates and the brain is part of the body. And somehow people expect the brain to be intact in old age, but it isn't. It deteriorates with the rest of the person. So I think acknowledging that this is not a disease, but this is a normal part, not for everybody, but some people, when they get very old and their brain is deteriorated, because of old age, and maybe Parkinson's or other kinds of illnesses that happen when you get very old, that this is not, as I say, a disease. This is something that happens to people, but that their emotions, their human needs for love, for expression, they stay. In fact, they grow. Sometimes the less cognition the person has, the more intuition they have.
Fascinating.
I'm respecting that, I think.
And so how do you access their verbal parts if their brain cells have died? Or if their brain cells aren't dead, why are they unable to access those verbal parts all the time?
Well, there's certain verbal parts you access, like mother and a loved one, husband, and people will respond to that. And I think that whatever is left, whatever synapses are still there, they begin to ignite. And the person might not be very verbal, but at least they can say mother, but they communicate so much through their eyes and through their movements.
Mm-hmm.
And when Gladys Wilson was tapping, I tapped with her.
Yes.
And that brought us together.
Yes.
So, and I just want to say that I did a group, and a lady, I guess it was a social worker, came. This was in the Montefiore home in many years ago. And after the group, she said to me, you know what you're doing? You're validating the people. And that's how the term, because I didn't know, I called this group work with disoriented old people in a nursing home.
Right.
And I was teaching at that time at the School of Applied Social Sciences in Cleveland. And the students said, you need a better name for what you're doing. People asked me to explain it. So, and that's when this lady said, what you're doing is validating the people. That's what the word validation came about.
Okay. I'd like to ask you, with this approach in mind, when my own grandmother passed away a number of months ago, she was just turning 96. Yeah. And she, her mind was starting to deteriorate from when she was in her upper 80s or 90. And over the course of that time, I watched as many family members would come in and say, Bubby, do you remember this? Do you remember that? And I said to them, I'd like to show you something that I kind of stole from your mindset, if you will. And rather than saying, Bubby, do you remember your phone number? Or do you remember the names of your children? I said to her, 718-851, and she finished the phone number. I started to say the names of the children, and she finished the names of the children. Can you explain to us, how are we accessing something different when we started and ended versus when we ask a more abstract question?
Well, I think she felt familiar. When you gave the names of her children, or she felt connected. So what is there, the connections, they started to come out, emerge. And so you didn't say, tell me this and tell me that, but you said, when Bubby, when you went to see your mother, and so on, and then she was able, oh yeah, and so on.
Vicki?
I just want to add, that is in fact one of the techniques in validation, particularly with people who express mainly non-verbally, that instead of asking open questions, you would ask closed questions or offer a choice or something that triggers the memory. Often it's sort of like memory Parkinson's. It's difficult to get started, but once they get started, they can do more.
So it's on to that music. If you sing like with Gladys Wilson, it was Jesus Loves Me, but with a Jewish lady, it would be, und wenn der Mama kommt, kommt all the Hasidim. So it's my job. If I'm dealing with someone from China, and I have worked in China and Japan, I need to learn a Japanese lullaby, a Japanese love song. And if I sing that love song and then touch that person where they were touched by their lover, their eyes light up, and often they start to talk. Not always, but sometimes.
So the key,
they respond.
yeah.
They respond.
Right.
So it sounds like the key is accessing the deeper emotional parts of them and staying further away from the cognitive, logical parts. And that's how we'll access people as their minds deteriorate.
Right. When I first started, and I didn't know about reality orientation. I mean, I had read about it, but I didn't pay attention to it because I knew the people, and I knew that this is not the right thing to do. But the people who espoused reality orientation got very angry at me, and they said, people should know where they are. They have a right to know the time and the day and so on. So that's what I had to deal with in the beginning.
So it took some chutzpah to break through.
Yeah, well, you know what? It wasn't so much chutzpah, but it was knowing I was doing the right thing. And when you know you're doing the right thing, you don't care about people who do the wrong thing.
But you lived in such a unique set of circumstances. You were the youngest old woman ever. I mean, all your friends were all in their 90s and 100s, right? And that was your social group.
That's true. You're absolutely right.
So you had a much deeper and more intuitive way of connecting with them.
That's right. Yeah, I think I told you about Isidore Rose and my father.
Yes.
That moment of identity when we both hated my father.
That was great. I remember, I'm trying to remember, I can't recall the details, but I recall both from your book and in some of the other talks that you've given, other anecdotes that you had where you went deeply into a person's experience as if it were happening right now, right here. Can you recall offhand any of those other instances when somebody was raging?
You mean when they were like crying?
Crying or raging or something, and you went right along with it?
Well, sometimes in the middle of my group, someone would start yelling right in the middle. And so what I learned to do was like, oh, you're so angry. What do you want to do to that person? And the other old people who also were diagnosed with the dementia empathized with that because they got angry too. And then I would say, Mrs. Stuttgart, did you get angry like that? Like Mrs. Evans? And Mrs. Stuttgart, ah! And we communicated on little words, but a lot of feelings. And after a while, that person that you swore a lot less. These behaviors lessened as the emotions emerged.
I think that's just so incredible. Can you tell us the story, Naomi, of, I believe it was the woman, I may be getting this wrong, but I think it was a woman whose husband died at war, I think it was, when they were, or her husband or his wife died at a very, very young age, when they were just newlywed or something like that. Do you know what story I'm talking about?
I don't.
I believe it's on, I thought it's on one of your talks. I may be saying it wrong.
Remember, Vicki? Probably
Vicki?
too, but I haven't read my books for a while.
I think it's your role play where it's the start of you stole my wedding ring.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you go into the audience and you talk about how your husband
she was hiding it under the pillow, hiding the ring in different places.
Wait a minute, go on, Vicki.
Well, what you do is you go into the audience and you say,
Stole my wedding ring.
stole my wedding ring. And who here has a wedding ring? Are you married? Are you married? Look at your tiny little ring.
Yeah, this was my way.
Here?
Yeah,
Do you remember this?
I do. I do.
Carry on.
My way of saying my husband loved me. Look, he gave me a big ring. And you hardly have any ring at all, because I was feeling the loss of my husband. And so I put down all the other women who had maybe a husband in order to say, oh boy, my husband really loves me. Look, he gave me this very big ring. In reality, the woman that I was role playing, my husband never even gave me a ring. I had to buy it at the dime store, a cheap wedding ring. So now in my old age, I can't directly say I feel bad because my husband didn't love me enough to give me a beautiful wedding ring, but it came out this way, like, you stole my wedding ring. You give it back to me. So people have a way of working out their unfinished business when they get very old. And an understanding worker tries to step into their, you have to know her history a little bit, that her husband maybe went out with other women somehow. That's in the history. You have to know as much as you can, and then you can get into the world and find a place in your own life. When I was afraid that my husband was fooling around with other women, and that'll make the identification really close and true. You have to be honest. If you're not honest, it doesn't work.
Go ahead, Vicki. Did you want to say something?
I was going to say also using the ring as a symbol,
Right.
and that hiding the ring and saying, and then blaming other people, you hid it from me, that we have to recognize that that ring is a symbol. And by knowing the history, just what you said, we can find the empathy with the other person. And instead of saying, oh no, here it is in your top drawer, say,
Yeah, what she's saying is, you stole my youth. You stole all the wonderful things of my life. The wedding ring, as you said, Vicki, is a symbol. You stole that house in the country that he promised me and he never did. He stole all the love that I wanted and never had it just because he was fooling around. All that is, as you say, is a symbol, the wedding ring of that. And it all can come out. And an empathetic worker who really listens using validation techniques. One is rephrasing. You mean? You don't lie, but you don't argue. You mean you're saying that I stole your wedding ring? That's right. That was that white gold wedding ring that you stole. And as my feelings come out, I'm more and more relieved because I'm expressing myself. And I have found that the accusations lessen.
Yes.
As people express themselves.
I'd like to encourage anyone who has a question, who'd like to pose a question or a comment, to please use the raise your hand bar on the bottom right of the screen. And I'm sure Naomi would be glad to validate the question and maybe even give an answer. Can you talk a little bit to, I don't know if you've ever worked with children, as far as I know, I'm not sure that you have, but you know, a senior or an old person who has dementia is kind of 80 years past their child stage. And a lot of these repressed memories are defenses or defense mechanisms from so many things that occurrences and instances that happened when they were children. How can we apply the same validation method when working with children or raising children, so that when they are in their 80s or 90s, some of this possible childhood trauma will be mitigated?
Well, if a very old person, cries constantly, doesn't stop crying, you know that this is something that happened from way, way back. And when you read the history, you find out maybe that this woman was abused by her stepfather, which happens more and more than you would think, things like that. And she cried and cried and wailed. And so I didn't know that was not in the history, that she was abused, really. It was not mentioned out loud, but it was undertone mentioned. So when I said, did he hurt you? And I was crying with her. And what did he do to you? And if they didn't do anything, she won't respond. But if he did do something, then she would open up. And those feelings would be expressed. And when I saw her the next week, she was much, much better. She wasn't so sad anymore because she had released all this stuff. So that's what's so important, I think, in the validation groups, is that the feelings are expressed to someone, an empathetic listener, and then the people are relieved. And they're ready to die more. I think people are preparing for death too. They're in resolution. So they need to express stuff.
It's amazing. We have a question here from someone in the audience. Her name is Chana Sherman. Chana actually presented for us on children a number of weeks ago. So she's a brilliant clinician in her own right. Go ahead, Chana.
I was wondering if you're familiar at all with the book Creating Moments of Joy by Jolene Bracke, I think it is.
Someone's going to have to, yeah, I couldn't understand.
You have to speak a little slower.
Oh, sorry. I was wondering if you're familiar at all with the book Creating Moments of Joy by Jolene Bracke. Who talks about working with people with validation. She's actually not a clinician. She's not coming from that route. She's coming from, I think, a nursing end. And it's a workbook for family members and people working with people who have dementia and Alzheimer's. And some of the beautiful things she has about going with the client where they're at. For example, if somebody is talking about, where's my husband, instead of saying, oh, he passed away, to say, oh, don't you know he's still at work, or something like that, where it comes.
That's a therapeutic lie. That's not validation. And sorry, I jumped in there. We never lie to somebody. We never pretend.
Okay.
Never say your husband is, coming later, or because another principle in validation is that, and you're probably familiar with it, all people have various levels of consciousness, and often we can be aware on 2 or more levels. Right, Mom?
Right. I was
just let her. Yeah, Mom.
Sorry. No, I'm sorry. I was. Go ahead.
All right. I was just trying to add that if I say I have to see my mother, and you say she's coming around the corner, I'll sit down, because with my mind's eye, I can really see my mother, and I love my mother, but on another level, I know my mother is dead because I was at her funeral. I saw her eyes in her coffin. I know my mother is no, and deep, deep awareness. If you tell me your mother's coming, I don't trust you.
Wow. This is fascinating. In other words, there are two parts to the person. There's the part that knows the truth, and there's the part that's looking to be validated and to have the pain understood. So when she's crying for her mother, she just wants to feel validated and feel heard. She knows her mother's not here. Is that what you're saying?
More or less. Yeah,
she may also need, it's an expression of needs. And here you can go back to basic human needs.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is for love, to be loved, and one of them is to be useful, to be heard, to express emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Wow.
So what we do is we explore, we accompany the older adult as he or she expresses whatever need they feel in that moment, without judgment, without pretending, and very important, without trying to make it better.
Yes.
Not a goal in validation.
Yeah.
We have another question from Yehudis. Yehudis,
Hi, how are you?
go ahead. Can you turn on your video, or is that not an option?
Not an option
Not an option. Okay,
right now.
Oh, dear.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so in terms of clients who have strong levels of denial and disconnect and want their reality validated, you know, for whatever it is, and I don't know, how do you go about, I'm curious about that.
Can you give a specific example?
If a client wants validated that they did something wrong because they had to do it. And I don't know.
But you're using psychological terms and labels that create distance between you and the other person. And in validation, the idea is to get in close, no matter what, emotionally close. So let's take away the word validation, or wants to feel validated. This is a person who is expressing something. They have a need. So we want to go into that. What is the need? What's going on? And they might say, what? What would that person say if I came up to them and said, what's going on?
You heard this.
Yeah, so if after a while you did do this, I didn't prepare my question well enough, so I'm just like going along. But if after a while you did keep doing that, keep validating, and they still didn't move from, let's say you thought that the reality.
Don't worry about it.
So, but do you ever reach a point when it's not, when you do give a reality check?
Never. Never.
What, Vicki? I couldn't understand.
She says, is there ever a point when you try to bring reality into it? And I said, never, because that's not the issue, what's real or not real.
And let me add to that, Vicki.
Yeah.
You go into the old person's reality. You're able to put your own reality aside. And in order to have empathy, you go into that person's reality, and you can always find something in that person that you can empathize with. If she's angry at her mother, you find a time in your life when you were mad at your mom, when you were a teenager. And the people express these basic emotions and through symbols. And if you tune into that, you'll find you have a wonderful relationship with the person, and the acting out behavior will lessen.
Maybe.
Somebody asked a nice question that I was wondering about myself. How do you find this effective with those suffering from psychosis? Do you find similar results with psychosis?
I couldn't hear. Could you tell me what you?
He's asking, does validation work with individuals who have psychosis?
No, well, I will say this. The basic attitude of listening goes for everybody.
Yes.
Now, if I'm psychotic and I say there's little bugs up there and they're creeping into my bed every night, you know that those bugs are a symbol of something unpleasant. So you're able to be non-judgmental, and I think that's so important. Even though it's weird behavior, people are very clever in how they use symbols. And even if you don't understand the bugs, you can still explore with them. You feel uncomfortable with all these bugs all around. And yes, I do. And what are they, and so on. And you use the other validation technique.
Well, yeah, I just want to add that the validation method is created specifically as a whole thing for older adults who are in the final stage of life, who have cognitive decline. You have to start cherry picking from the method to use it with other populations. So for instance, people with early onset Alzheimer's, you're not going to reach the same goals using validation, because the main goal of validation is to accompany people in the resolution stage of life and to keep communicating with them so that they can relieve themselves of whatever is on their heart or minds in that moment. In the beginning, Mom, you used to write, this method is not for people with psychosis or any kind of psychiatric history, and for people who are 80 and above, and I forget what the other one was. Normal, they just don't have the coping mechanisms to deal with the losses of getting older. And that's the population that responds the best to validation as a method.
One of the things that I wonder is if we follow some of these older adults and use the validation method with them regularly, do you find that they begin to open up and access more on their own? Or is it only in the moment that you're applying the method that they will be able to access these memories? Because I know you've said that their behaviors overall might start calming down because some of their old stuff may have been resolved. But do you find that they're now able to stay in a mode where they are, have come back to themselves a little bit, or do they zone back out?
They never lose themselves. And that's an interesting point. When somebody withdraws inward, what is lost? They don't lose themselves. They've got themselves, but they've lost the environment, and the environment has lost them. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
I think the validation has to initiate something. Although the people will be less acting out if they're angry or crying. You'll find if you go into their rooms or into the ward, they won't be crying so much and they'll be better. But you also need to keep using the touch or the eye contact or the music or whatever you were using for this to continue. You can't just say, oh, they're better now, and stop and walk away.
Yeah. Oh, that obviously. My question is more, if you follow a patient, if you were, so to say, aid of a patient, and you worked for several hours a day re-accessing those old memories and experiences, will they begin to come out of their shell a bit more? I see Vicky's shaking her head, but will they begin to come out of their shell a little bit more and sort of on their own access some of this, or is it only as long as you're applying the technique?
Well, in a group, that's my experience with group work, people do, once they're comfortable, once they've expressed their emotions, all you have to do is start singing, "You Are My Sunshine," and the song they know, and all the feelings will come out and the singing and so on. But I think if the staff, if this is a nursing home or a facility, and if the staff uses validation techniques or uses music, you'll find that people, when they're alone on the ward, they'll start singing and humming with each other.
So there is somewhat of a resurrection to some degree of people's lost and repressed selves that we can access.
And people who were like teachers in the validation group, you have a welcomer, someone who's like the president, and starts your group. And after a while, you'll find that that person will on their own, on the ward, become like a hostess. Or people who, women who always served their men and had group. You'll find if you give out cookies, the person who never walked will take those cookies and will walk over to the next person, offer them the cookie.
So it really reignites their personalities.
Yes, it does.
They re-access their personalities.
That's a good way of saying it, yes. Yeah.
Vicky, were you going to say something?
Pardon?
Vicky wanted to say something.
Oh,
you were talking about the long-term benefits and does it last? And the answer is, yeah, it really does, whether it's individual or group. And my strongest experience was I worked in a nursing home for maybe a year, 2 years, and then I went away for a few years, and then I came back. And one of the people in my validation group, he saw me walk onto the unit, and he stood up, and he went, "Vicky!" And I never even knew that he knew my name because knowing my name was not important, so I didn't really push it ever.
Yeah.
And that's years later. That I found extraordinary. People do change, but in their way. It's not that they're calmer. It's not that they're more oriented. They're living their lives according to their own needs and not according to house rules or my rules. They're doing their thing. And, tell the story of Mrs. Gogolick and going to work, because that's such a great story.
You tell it, you remember it.
Yeah.
She had her possible.
She used to put on her hat and her coat and the purse and go down to that lobby, to the red velvet settee in the middle of the lobby. Mm-hmm. She'd take her hat off and her coat off, and she would open her handbag and she would start putting envelopes and tissues and anything she could find. And Mrs. Gogolick used to be an executive secretary at GE. And so she was going to work every day and filing things, and her handbag was the symbol of a filing cabinet, which I always thought that was enormously creative, using what you have to fulfill the need to be useful. And I thought it was fantastic that nobody tried to stop her and just let her do it because she wasn't hurting anybody. There's a nursing home in Austria where I used to teach a bit. And there was one lady who would go outside of the nursing home. It was not a locked wing, totally disoriented. She didn't know. Well, she went out and there was a bus stop and she would wait at the bus stop and the bus stopped for her. Driver opens the door, says, "Come on in, Mrs. Smith." And she gets on the bus. She sits in her chair. Bus driver drives his entire route and drops her right back an hour later in front of her where she lived. He says, "This is your stop." She gets out and she goes back into the nursing home feeling very satisfied. And that is an example of where validation has been incorporated not just in that one nursing home facility, but the entire community. That bus driver had been taught what to do when Mrs. Smith goes to the bus stop. And the entire community, backed by the mayor, granted it's a small town, but that's going with them. That's validating their reality.
Wow. One of the themes that seems to keep coming up, both in reading your books and listening to some of your talks and listening to Vicky talk, is that it seems that many of us, but we see it more prominently in old age. And I know, Naomi, you and I were talking about Erickson before the show started. And it seems that there are so many people who are stuck or arrested in a particular stage of development. And that's what's causing the same repetitive behaviors or fixations on certain behaviors or themes. And what I'm hearing you say is that once you use the validation technique or the validation method with them, they're able to peacefully resolve that stage of development. Is that how you would describe it?
Vicky?
I would say they are in the process of resolving until they die. Like you said at the very top of this hour, people have lost brain cells because they're old. And so short-term memory is not great. Everybody ages in their own way, depending on genes and experience, life experience. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Naomi, does it answer my question?
This is an example of memory loss. I lost my track of thought. Yes, I had a good answer.
Okay, so let me revive the question. The question, it feels to me like people are sort of arrested in stages of development. And when we use the validation method, we sort of soothe and calm and resolve, or partly resolve, as Vicky's pointing out, those arrested stages. And when you talked about them being able to die in peace or die more peacefully, it seems like those stages of development are being resolved through the validation. Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah, they are resolving. It's
Resolving.
an ongoing thing. It's never resolved, period.
Yeah.
And it will probably be resolving until they die. But it's a struggle for resolution. It's a struggle to justify, I led a good life. I'm a good person. Or, yeah, I went on all these wonderful sabbaticals and did all these things that I wanted to do. Just to work things through with yourself so that you can, when you are ready to die, it's kind of a peaceful kind of a thing.
And at the same time, it seems that people are stuck in particular stages.
That could be. People say who never expressed their adolescence.
Yes.
In a nursing home where they would take all their anger out against the administrator, as Mr. Rose did, because he never had a chance to
Autonomy.
Be a teenager. Yeah. So yes, they will be using people in the home, the administrator, the social worker, the nurse, as a symbol. And some people hate the nurses because they symbolize authority and
sexuality.
And sexuality. And if they were abused by their parents, they will use the staff as a way of expressing this. And I think it's an effort, a struggle to resolve stuff that I kept down, that I haven't been able to express.
Right, right. Are there old age homes, nursing homes, assisted livings that are trained in the validation method and have the entire staff trained and utilizing it?
Have you seen that? I thought you said you had seen that.
I'm asking if there are nursing homes and assisted livings that are trained.
I haven't been working in the field for a while, but I'm hoping that they are using validation more, but I don't know. I think it's sad that after all these years, that this isn't a way you work with old people who have a dementia. This is what you do.
And I think that it will become a way. I think that you've created something that talks to people enough. The challenge is probably the buy-in aspect, where we have to get an entire staff to change their way of thinking, to change their way of behaving, and staff changes. There's turnover, which is hard to train. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit more, at some point, maybe off the air, about how this can become a little bit more prevalent and a little bit more accepted and adaptable. Because I think that this is
great. I had an administrator. It all has to do with the administrator. And I had the administrator at a very big staff meeting say of me, she's as crazy as the people she works with. That was his, and then when I had the group, when it was time for medication or the nurses would take, I worked so hard to get a welcomer and a secretary, whatever, in my group, and they would take them right out to toilet them or whatever they were doing. So it comes from the administrator. If the administrator understands validation and respects you, that's setting things down to the nursing.
The first step is that we need the administrator to care about the residents.
That's right.
When the administrator is someone who deeply cares about the residents, we'll have a chance of bringing the validation method. But the theory and rationale behind how this works, and again, in my own personal experience with my own grandmother, like I was explaining, describing to you at the beginning of the show, I've seen this work firsthand, and it's really a way of livening up and bringing back to life or resurrecting people who just seem completely, I hate to use this word, but waste. People see old people as wasted, and they're really not. They really have an entire story, an entire life, an entire. It's very interesting. The rabbis teach us in the Talmud that we have to respect an old sage who's lost his entire mind, because he's a vessel that's holding it and he just can't access it. And that's really how we have to see, we have tremendous respect for the elderly in our culture. Let's take another question, one last question. I know it's getting late here. It's 10:15 on the East Coast and 7:15 maybe dinner time by you. And we don't want you to miss your dinner. But Racheli Barish, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. I just want to say I really am enjoying this lecture. I thought the video was so touching, and it's just so awesome seeing that you really connected with that woman. I just had a question, and I've also worked in nursing homes, so I could totally appreciate that validation, and when you're getting pressure from the administrators and all of that. But my question was and I feel like that validation is so important. What would you do if you had some clients who, and especially in that old age, who had questions or had crises and wanted answers or solutions? Like, where like that validation is so important, but at the end they're almost like, and I do have clients like this, like, well, what do I do now? Or can you give me an answer to my question?
Well, what question, for example?
I'm just thinking, like, you know, let's say clients that I have who have some challenge or difficulty that they want like a quick solution to, or give me skills.
Example. Example.
Or I'm just thinking like theoretically, you know, because oftentimes I do have clients who I, you know, giving them a lot of validation, but then, you know, then they move to, okay, so now what?
Okay, Vicki, you had someone.
Yeah, thanks. Is this person 80 years old or older?
So I have a client who's like maybe 68.
That's pretty young. 68, you still can do therapy. You have a pretty functioning brain. So validation would not be a great method for that person. The population where the validation method as developed by Naomi Feil works best with people who are 80 plus, who have lived a relatively normal life, do not have a history of psychosis or schizophrenia or any psychiatric problem, and simply don't have the coping mechanisms to deal with the losses that come with aging. So I don't think using validation with this 68-year-old client would be useful. I think
Got it. Okay.
else would work better.
Let me add to that, that Dr. Alzheimer looked at the brain of a 51-year-old woman. Right. And he had worked with this woman, and he saw all these plaques and tangles in her brain. And he said, this is not normal. This woman is too young, 51, and look at the deteriorated brain. Now, if she were 81, then the brain normally deteriorates, but not at 51. This must be a disease. It wouldn't be a disease if you, like if I had, I'm 80, 90 now, and I have a lot of wrinkles. If I had all these wrinkles when I was 60, there'd be something wrong with my skin. But I am 90, so this happens to a 90-year-old person. Just an analogy.
Okay.
I think it's a matter of accepting aging.
It's now just after 10:15, and I'd like to start wrapping things up. If anybody has any last questions or comments, please either unmute yourself or raise your hand.
I would just like to say that in the chat, I put 2 links. One to the Validation Training Institute website, where you'll find information about the 23 training centers that we have in 13 countries. We work in 9 different languages, including Hebrew, because we've got a training center in Tel Aviv, and China and Japan and all across Europe and also in the United States. I think we need to do better work in the United States and get more training centers going in more regions. During this COVID period, we've created a lot of online learning possibilities, from very simple tutorials. I'm working now on building blocks of skills, and we've got a full certification course that is blended learning. Because a lot of these things you can't learn online. It's very tough to teach how to use that touch that Naomi demonstrated so beautifully in Gladys. You need to feel that. I need to be able to touch your cheek for you to kinesthetically get what that does. So pedagogically, certification courses, there has to be at least one long, intensive in-person session component. But we've developed a lot of cool things also for family caregivers. I'm working on one for physicians and managers, administrators, because all of their needs are different. So I would encourage you, if you would like more, please check out the website.
Yes, and we can't forget, again, to me, what talks the loudest is Naomi's affective voice, and that emotion bound. I can't believe, And Naomi, I thought that maybe at 90 you wouldn't be as effective in that, but apparently it's still growing on you. When I watch those little TED Talks or shows or demonstrations that you've given, it becomes so alive. And I think that when you talk about reigniting the resident or the elderly patient through the emotion, it's really when you bring in that tone of voice that Mama may have used when she was telling a story to the little girl. That there's something to that really raises the interest and the curiosity. And I think that might also be speaking to some of the older folk that you're addressing. I found that to be poignant.
If we could just get away from the disease model a little bit and just look at what normal aging is. Did I say, I think that Alzheimer opened the brain of a 51-year-old lady. Did I just say that?
Yes.
Here's an example of memory loss. But I remembered my memory loss, so that's it.
Okay, Naomi, it's been such an honor to have you on. If there's a sort of message that you'd like to convey to the younger generation, that of social workers and psychologists and therapists and geriatric workers, what would that message be?
Well, if very old people act weird, that this is a normal way for that person in that stage of life to express his human needs. And so the worker, the empathetic worker, needs to share those emotions with the person and be non-judgmental. I guess that's it, being non-judgmental.
Being non-judgmental. And that probably applies across the board to working with people. Right. It applies across the board.
True.
Okay, well, it's been such an honor. We really appreciate, Vicki, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was saying goodbye.
Oh, this isn't a goodbye. This is just a temporary break. I have a feeling we'll still be in touch. But thank you,
Very
Naomi
good.
Feil, for your expertise, your revolutionary approach, revolutionary, groundbreaking work to bring this awareness to the world of geriatrics, and I think the world of psychotherapy at large. And it's been greatly appreciated. And again, I'm convinced, just because of the truth in it, I'm convinced, we know the rule that when there's truth, it will eventually flourish. And I'm convinced that this is something that is going to be taken to the next level probably very soon and adopted by professionals all over. So thank you for joining us and for this great opportunity.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I don't get it all the time. I'm grateful to you.
Okay, well, I take that as an invite to have us invite you back then.
Anytime.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have that much time. I'm 90 years old, so you got to do it quick.
Well, I beg to differ. We go till 120. Bis 120.
Okay.
Okay, and thank you, Vicki, again for arranging it. Okay, good night.
I'm grateful to Vicki for being, when I die, she will continue. And I'm so grateful to her for that.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and good night. And hope to see you next week on Mondays with Moshe. Bye-bye.